It's been said that my role is kind of like the architect of the show. If you present one thing to them, they might give you a whole bunch of notes, where if you present four things to them, they'll pick one, and then you can run with that one. It's a great time to be a concept artist, or it might be a terrible time to be a concept artist. My name is Greg Teegarden. I am a digital effects supervisor at Digital Domain. We just delivered Black Adam, and guess we can go from there.
Greg, so for someone who's been living under a rock for the last years, introduce us to Digital Domain. What do you guys do? Maybe some of the projects that you worked on. What kind of services do you guys provide? Because this is like a very large company with a lot of branches and all over the world. It would be nice if you could give us a little bit of kind of a background and that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay. So Digital Domain was originally founded by back in 1993, I believe it was, by Scott Ross, Jim Cameron, and Stan Winston. And one of the first big shows that they did was True Lies and Titanic. They've done a lot of big movies over the years. We have a number of divisions. We have our feature film division, of course. We also have a commercials and games division. We also do what they refer to as real time, which is usually projects that use Unreal Engine as the way that the imagery is presented, and we also do motion capture, volume capture. We do episodic television work, and we have locations in Playa Vista in Los Angeles. We have another location in Vancouver, British Columbia, also in Montreal, and we have locations in Beijing and in Hyderabad, India.
So I guess most of the people kind of know your work from feature films, and you've done like a lot of stuff throughout the years. But let's concentrate on the stuff that you've been currently doing and your collaboration with Warner and DC. How did you start working on Black Adam? What were like the main things that you were tasked to do there? Like, how does these kind of projects of that scale usually start?
Well, generally it starts with a bid. So we were approached by Warner Brothers, and I myself personally did not bid on this job. That's usually the role of the visual effects supervisor and our bidding producer. And they had bid that thing for a while. It had been something that had been spinning around for some time. And if it wasn't for the pandemic, this movie would have come out much sooner. And the pandemic kind of basically shut everything down for a period of time. And so we actually wound up then bidding the movie again. And by the time that I came on the show, it had already been bid and awarded. So my role as a digital effects supervisor I'm usually the second one to come on a show after it's awarded, because my job is to help get the show set up, look at staffing, look at schedules, kind of like it's been said that my role is kind of like the architect of the show. So I am the one who tries to figure out how many people we're going to need and what roles, and then once all that happens, then sort of basically it's like building an airplane would be a good way to describe it. Every show kind of starts off the same way, but every airplane or every show is a little different. And so what you're doing is you're going out and you're getting the wings, and you're getting the fuselage, and you're getting the engines, and you're putting all this stuff on, and then your job is to basically get the airplane in the air and get it flying. And then once that happens, then you can kind of take a little bit of a step back, and your job at that point is just to kind of make sure the airplane stays flying. And then when we're getting ready to deliver the show, your job is to help facilitate the landing of the plane.
I think if I were to build a little bit on your metaphor, is like if you've built a very good plane, you don't really have to do much work when it kind of lift off, and maybe you help a little bit when it's landed. But if the job is not really well done, you have to kind of fix the plane as it's flying and the things are falling out.
Right. And what happens sometimes is like sometimes some shows are very rushed, and it's like you're building the plane and trying to fly it at the same time. And those are the ones that are always the trickiest to work on. But the good news with this show is that we didn't have to do that. We pretty much had a pretty well functioning plane in the air by the time that we needed to start producing shots. And so
Correct. So
it was a smooth ride.
That's so. First of all, thank you for kind of telling it a little bit about the bidding and all that stuff, because that's some of the things like that are kind of, they're usually behind the lines. People don't really see what's going on there. But I have another question for you. So we had a lot of guests from companies that are doing CGI, kind of like these heavy lifting productions, and doing this work is always very challenging because, like you mentioned, you need to figure out the capacity that you need in order to, serve all the needs that the customer might have. And I'm trying to understand, how do you guys do it? Like, do you have like a creative brief coming in with breakdown of the scenes, and they kind of tell you, in this scene we need like a hurricane, in this scene we need a little bit of a spoiler, the guy melting or stuff like that? Or maybe you kind of go forward and say, hey, we can do this and that, or our director maybe helps out and says, he kind of gives you a little bit more work to do, and then you need to figure out, like, you need to hire more people. Like, how does this, because it's a very kind of fragile balancing act that you're trying to do when you're trying to figure out exactly how many people do you need to kind of build something as vast as, like a DC movie.
Absolutely. And you know what? It's both. It honestly is. And I'll go back to the bid again. It starts with the bid. So when we're bidding the shots, when we're bidding the show, we have a pretty good idea of what the scope of work is going to be, partly based on experience that we've had with other kinds of movies of this genre, and then partly just because, or because we're provided material from the client and we understand what it is they're trying to do. And so during the bidding process, we have a lot of experience in that department. And because, like, if there's a shot, for example, we'll take like the melting guy as an example. When we're bidding that, we're already starting to slot artist resources into what we think it will take to get that done. And so by the time that a bid's done, we have a pretty good idea of what kind of crew we're going to need. We may not have the individual names associated with it yet of who's going to do what, but we know kind of roughly how many artists we're going to need and what departments and when we need to bring them on and et cetera. So that right there is what happens before the show's even awarded, or excuse me, after it's awarded, but before the work actually starts to come in. Then to answer the other side of your question, if the director says like, okay, well, this is what I really want, then that's where we have to improvise and sometimes move things around, move resources around, maybe pull artists that we didn't think we were going to need onto the show, or maybe artists that we thought we were going to need now, maybe we don't need now, and so we can retask them up to other shows.
Greg, so you mentioned input from director. I think there was a lot of conversation, especially if you go to like YouTube or somewhere where people are doing VFX. They're saying, okay, that there are these guys who are directing these high-budget, high-profile movies, and a lot of them are coming from, especially if it's like their second or third film, they're coming from smaller productions. They don't really know what people are capable of. And sometimes it's hard for VFX teams to kind of communicate, and for directors themselves to communicate what do they can do, what is achievable, what is not achievable, and stuff like that. How does this process work? Especially since you guys have so much experience, you probably have a lot of know-how and you understand this process very well. How do you communicate with the director, create other stakeholders of what can be achieved, you know, how this guy's gonna melt, what are the ways that you can kind of show this so you don't waste a lot of people's time and resources and everything's kind of like running smoothly?
A lot of that probably comes from just experience, really. I can't say it in any other way. With a company like Digital Domain, we've been doing this kind of work for decades now. And a lot of the people at the company, myself included, have been here for considerable amounts of time. And so we have a pretty good understanding or a pretty good idea of what we need to do to achieve what it is the I'll just refer to as our client. It can be the director or it can be the show side visual effects supervisor. Um, they basically communicate to us what it is they want. And then it's really our job at that point to figure out what the execution looks like. Like, you know, what are the technical things that we're going to have to do this? So like the melting thing, for example, we had a pretty good idea what we were going to have or what we would need to do to realize that those sequence of shots. But you never really know for sure until you get into it. And then of course you get notes, and so then you have to basically whatever the notes you get are, you're going to have to improvise then on that to give them what it is they're looking for. But it really comes down to experience at the end of the day, because if and it's not just it's the experience of the company as a whole. There's a lot of different disciplines. There's a lot of different artists in the company and supervisors who have been doing this kind of work for a long time. And so we all sit down in a meeting together and we say, okay, this is what we got to do. What's the best path to getting there? And people throw out ideas and we discuss it. And someone will say, I've got an idea. And they go run off on their computer and they come back the next day and they say, hey, I got this thing I want to show you. And we look at them and go like, hey, that just might work. And then we develop something that will eventually start to look like that, something that looks halfway decent. And at that point, then we share it with the client and say, hey, what do you think? Is this the kind of direction you guys want to go? And if they say, yeah, that's great, then we keep running with it. Or if they say, no, we want something different, then we have to switch gears and restart that process.
This is a super interesting point. So basically, let's take my experience. So I probably had this meeting with this guy like 5 years ago or something, and he said, okay, so I was a VFX artist. I worked on, I'm not gonna mention the movie, but I worked on a movie, and like it was like 3 years or 5 years production, and I was working on like smoke somewhere, like a little bit, and I was just doing that, right? So it's like not a lot of other things that I've been kind of contributing to, and you can maybe see it for like second here, second there when the production is going on and the film is in the cinema. And my question is, like, that was a long time ago. Like he moved from films to other areas and so on. When you are in this kind of iterative process, when this guy is kind of running out of the meeting and he's trying to build something on his computers, what are the tools, the ways that you are approaching this? Are you doing more like of a storyboard approach where you just kind of do a pen, pencil and kind of color something out? Or do you use something like Unreal where you want a very quick, you know, scene built up, or Maya where you want to do some animations, kind of do very bare bones? Or do you do it with like some simulations like Houdini or like effects, or like what are the kind of traditional ways of kind of starting iterating, thinking about it, but not going like full scale, you know, dedicating 5 years to building that smoke?
Again, I'll take our melting guy as an example for something like that, since we kind of keep coming back to it. It starts off with a concept, and it might be something like we just go on the internet and we look for examples of what, like, you know, burned flesh looks like. What does that look like? And we'll just go and we'll just like download examples of it and study it. And we might even present that to the client at that point and just say, hey, is this a direction that we should go in? And if they say, yeah, that looks pretty good, let's go in that direction. Then at that point, now we have to think to ourselves, okay, how do we take this reference that we found and bring it into an asset that we can actually manipulate and iterate on. And so it might start with, in the instance of this guy again, we just start with our generic human head that we have in our as part of our DD asset library, and we'll just have artists start painting textures that kind of look like this material. And we will start with that, and then we will maybe do some renders of that. We'll share that with the client. Hey, what do you think? It looks great. Okay, now we've got to make it move. Now we got to make it. We got to turn it from something that looks non-burned to something that is burned. And so now maybe what we'll start doing is we'll rely on our Houdini department and our effects artists, and they're going to start going in and coming up with some ideas on how to do maybe some kind of reveal mats that do different stages of reveal. We'll discover that we need more than just top surface topology. We also need muscles underneath, and we need fat in the skin, and we need a bone structure, and we need a vascular system, because all that stuff is being revealed and being illuminated as the shot progresses. And so we incorporate more and more of that stuff in. And then once we're kind of happy with how it looks, we then share it with the client. And by this point, they already sort of know the direction we're going. And so it's highly unlikely, unless there's a change in the actual storyline itself, or if the shot gets changed for whatever reason, that they're going to decide that that's not what they want and they go off in a different direction. So we've already sort of laid a foundation in the beginning, using reference photography and then building basic, what do you want to call it? Just simple, not invest too much time into it, a base asset. And then once that's approved, then we sort of like build on that. And that's where we really start spending a lot of our time then, is in the later iterating and going along.
This is fascinating. Basically, what you're describing is that it's a very collaborative process. It's not something that, like the director or the art director, they come to you and say, hey, I want it this way. It's like, it's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of iterations. You're kind of like presenting your vision. So basically, you are one of like a big cogs in this machine that kind of moves this Hollywood production.
Yes, we are definitely a creative partner in this, for sure. So it's my experience over the years that when our job is to give the client the vision of what it is that they need to tell their story in the way that the director finds compelling and exciting. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, there's a lot of back and forth that goes in there. I haven't really been in an experience where it's just dictated to us, and that's what you do. It does happen sometimes, like depending on directors. Some directors know exactly what they want, and they just say, "This is what I want," and as long as you give them as long as you give them that, it's great. But oftentimes, what happens is that they have an idea what they want, but they haven't quite wrapped their heads around it themselves, because they're still trying to figure it out for their own film. And so that's where the collaborative part comes in, and we spend a lot of time, and we'll like maybe show them things that they hadn't considered. And they're like, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that." And if they love it, then we'll just continue off in that direction. Or sometimes they don't like something I should do. Sometimes you'll show them something and they're like, no, that looks great, but it's not what I'm looking for X, Y, and Z reasons. Let's go back to what we originally were talking about. And so at that point, then we just go, okay, and we switch gears and we go back to that.
So to kind of build up on that, and we keep coming back to that if one effect, but I just want to mention that you did a lot of other elements in that film. You like the high speed movement, and when the wings are opening up in one of the characters and how they unfurl, and all of that. And I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little about the technology that is currently being used. And the first step there is to talk a little bit about the procedural tools and how are they kind of different from what we've had before, and maybe you can share some of your thoughts, like what is going on with them currently and in the future. So procedural tools, I'm talking about stuff like SideFX Houdini or Substance Designer, kind of like where you have this non-destructive workflow and you can play around with a lot of parameters and kind of change them up and kind of get more and more interesting results. How do you use them? Do you find benefit in them? What are like the advantages, disadvantages? What do you like about them? What do you don't like about them?
Well, I mean, I think you sort of answered the question a little bit when you said they're non-destructive. Um, it allows you to quickly try a lot of different things on a base asset, and present a lot of options very quickly. So that's one of the things that's, and like for like Substance Designer, for example, if we want, I keep coming back to the same thing because it's applicable. Um, the burn flesh on our character. I mean, you can, just because of the procedural nature of the way Substance Designer works and the way you can reroute inputs and output nodes and masks and this and that, you can come up with a lot of iterations in a very short period of time. And we did do that. And so something that would, like, maybe if it was a more traditional approach where somebody was just painting in Mari or even going back further like Photoshop or something like that, it would take somebody a long time to do that. Whereas like if you're using these more procedural tools, you can generate a lot of iterations or a lot of variations, I guess I should say, in a very quick amount of time. The same thing with Houdini. If you don't like the way something is, if you don't like the random seed that the thing spit out, you can just change it and maybe tweak a few other parameters and come up with something that's a variation of it. It doesn't change the overall theme of what you're doing, but it adds a little extra twist to it somewhere that creates something maybe unexpected. And that's when that can lead to a whole other then avenue of inspiration to uh, try new things or present more options to the client. Because the more things you present them, the more the quicker they're going to respond. And also what they tend to do is that if you present them with like 3 or 4 options, they will usually pick one. And which is great because then it's like you've cut through a problem of them trying to decide what it is that maybe they're looking for if they're not even sure themselves, or if they're having difficulty. If you present one thing to them, they might give you a whole bunch of notes, or if you present 4 things to them, they'll pick one, and then you can run with that one, and then it's generally a fairly smooth ride to getting it to completion.
Uh, Thank you for that answer. And you mentioned Mari. I smiled a little bit because this is the kind of software that only movie guys are mentioning on our podcast, and then everyone else is kind of like using some other stuff. But Mari is great, just for everyone who's listening. But talking about that kind of ability to generate a lot of stuff to choose from, I have to ask that question as well. This year in particular, there's been this explosion of tools that are using neural networks to generate some kind of image, right? Mostly they're using for, creating some kind of a sketch in a style of a certain guy or a certain painting. Do you guys use that at all, or at least play around with it, or is it something not on that level yet?
I mean, if you're like talking about the like
Mid-Journey, like
Mid-Journey, yeah. Like I've been playing a lot with Mid-Journey lately. And what's nice about something like that is that you can create extremely compelling concept art in very, very, very short amounts of time. We have not, or at least I have not. I don't know if I don't think even DD has at this point. I don't think that we've used a tool like that for concepting because it's still relatively new. I mean, it's been around for a while, but but the level of sophistication that these images or these things can pop out right now in just a matter of minutes is what it's been with about the last 6-8 months, maybe something like that.
it's very fresh, very
It's
fresh.
very fresh, yeah. And so, for example, on Black Adam, I mean, I was on that show for 18 months. So But I can see on shows that are spooling up right now that are especially this kind of genre or science fiction genre or fantasy genre. I could definitely see how tools like that would, if assuming that you know how to properly syntax the prompt that you're giving the algorithm. If you're looking for a dragon, for example, or something, you can just keep tweaking the prompt to kind of give you something that you want, and then give me 5 variations of that, and it'll spit out 5 variations, and you pick maybe the 3 or 4 you like best and present to the client. Say, hey, what do you think? And they'll probably pick one. And if they do,
Yeah.
now you've got a great foundation. It's like, okay, let's acetize this thing now. Let's actually build it for real in 3D. Let's texture it. Let's light it. Let's rig it if we want movement. So yeah, it's just extremely valuable. I see it being a very valuable tool in the future.
I actually get this reaction a lot from producers, like both in film and in games. They love this tool because from their experience, they have, like before, you have to go to like a concept artist, you have to wait for him to finish, and one guy usually means one style, so you probably have to go to a couple of guys, and then they, mix and match and wait for them and so on. And right now, it's kind of like you figure out the syntax, like you said, you have a look at the prompts, you come up with 10 or whatever different variations, and maybe they're not like 100%, but at least the mood is there, the shapes are there, and you can figure out along the lines. But that kind of poses another question, and that is this are these tools kind of like complements to your process, or do you feel like these could be they can basically push out the profession of a concept artist out of production?
There's been a lot of I have been debating that with some of my fellow
Yeah,
my
I could
fellow
see that.
artists
Yeah.
in the industry. And all of us are kind of the same opinion. And that is that it's a great time to be a concept artist, or it might be a terrible time to be a concept artist, um, depending on how comfortable you are with using this new tool. I kind of liken it to, um, back in the days when computer graphics replaced models, physical models, and the best model, or some of the really great, or even animation for that example. Let's take that. Let's take like 2D animation. There were guys out there who were really great at drawing characters on paper, doing a performance. And then when all of a sudden CG came along, it's like, oh, those people are going to be out of a job. And a lot of them were. But the really great computer animators in the early days, and I'm talking like going back to Jurassic Park, were guys who came from animation, traditional 2D animation, because they understood what it took to breathe life into a character and how they're supposed to move. So 3D was just taking the next step. And I think the same thing is going to happen with these tools like Midjourney. I think that good concept artists who actually know how to concept and know what they're looking for, or have an understanding of what it is that their client is looking for, will use tools like this to get 80% of the way there on a concept. And then they can use their own innate skills that they've developed over the years to take that image and now switch it up or paint over it or add stuff to it that would be difficult for the algorithm to figure out no matter what you type in the prompt. And that will just make them, again, better conceptors.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add on that point that these things, that technology shifts, they happen in this industry all the time. Like substance designer, Houdini's maybe a little bit older, but the new stuff comes up almost all the time. Every year something new, and people just kind of learn it, try to work with it, think about like photogrammetry and procedural tools, and even Photoshop. That was kind of like new at a certain period of time. The only question, I think, when we think about these AI-generated images is kind of how unique they are, right? Because a lot of them are kind of trained on existing art, And when you truly need something like, you know, out of the box, never seen before, then, I mean, human imagination, I feel it's still a big, a big advantage, and people shouldn't be super worried. So I have another question for you, and this is something that we see a lot in video game industry in particular, right? So let's say, I mean, just as movies, games are pretty capital heavy, right? You need to invest a lot of money into just the production, like the assets, the textures, the models themselves. It's a lot of time, a lot of people involved. And then what happens is, like, if there's no sequel, or there's no, you know, part 2, part 3, a lot of that stuff is just being kind of thrown out, right? So you generated a lot of stuff and it's not used anymore. So what happens with effects, kind of assets, maybe tech, in film? Like, do you reuse some of it, or is it just like so niche, so kind of per project that you kind of build all that stuff and it just kind of stays there and never to be used again?
It depends on the asset, really, to be honest with you. So let's take, I'll take an example of an asset we spent a lot of time developing, and that was Thanos for the Avenger series. We were the lead house on developing Thanos. They gave us a whole year to develop Thanos as a believable, breathing, talking, emoting character. And we used him in a couple of films. If Marvel doesn't make another movie with Thanos in it, we're never going to use Thanos again, because that's a Marvel property. They own Thanos. But there was a lot of other assets that we developed for Avengers that we could use, and they're more like generic type things. Like maybe we built a mountain range for you know, that's in the background of a planet somewhere, and we could certainly use that as inspiration. We could change it up because of the procedural way that these things are usually made. We could start with a base asset like that, and then make modifications to it if we need it for something else, or more generic things like trees. Vehicles get reused all the time, especially, you know, like, and when I say vehicles, I mean things like cars. You know, we have a library with hundreds of cars in them, and there's oftentimes in films where we have to have cars driving down a street that's not, you know, it's a CG street with CG buildings, CG cars, and we just, you know, we need to populate a street with cars, or generic people for that matter. We have a library of generic people, and they're nondescript. Maybe we have to change their wardrobe up a little bit, but we do that kind of stuff all the time. So proprietary assets that are usually that are specifically designed for a show, like Thanos, for example, we would not use Thanos again, unless Marvel hired us to use Thanos again. But other things that we develop for these films that are more generic in nature, that aren't specific to the Marvel universe or the DC universe or whatever, then yeah, we tend to reuse that stuff a lot.
So kind of maybe jumping from that question to a little bit of in a different area. I want to talk a little bit about real-time rendering technology, and a little bit more about Unreal, because I think when we first started 80 level, which was you know, not probably obviously not as old as like Digital Domain, but we had we saw this clash where kind of like this real-time tech was kind of going into films, and people were kind of playing around with it, not really trusting it that much, and kind of using it for here and there and so on. But now that we've seen Unreal in particular doing this incredible work and getting super high detailed like reflections and rendering, and everything's like looking super nice and crisp, do you see kind of like real-time tech slowly pushing away like the older rendering technology, or is it still kind of not there yet, and we still need to rely to kind of like, you know, like a nice processing station, you know, doing a lot of rendering, you know, in a different kind of like old school way?
I think that what So like we have what we have a real-time division within Digital Domain. And there's a real-time project that we did, which was it was Martin Luther King giving his "I Have a Dream" speech, and that was a real time. It was, I don't know how long the speech goes for. It's got some minutes behind it, and so we developed his asset in Unreal, and that's how that was realized, was through a real-time render. But I think that probably what real-time is more, I don't think it's, at least at Digital Domain, we're not using it so much for as a replacement of, say, Redshift or V-Ray or Mantra or any of the other renderers that we might be using. I think what real time is in the industry seems to be going more is doing real time backgrounds, like the kind of thing they did with the Mandalorian, that type of stuff. These LED walls where you create an environment and it's on a stage, a big stage now with these gigantic LED screens behind you, and you immerse the character into that environment. And so what you get is a character now that looks like they actually are in that environment, as opposed to shooting them on process screen and then after the fact compositing them into that environment and then trying to make sure that your lighting and reflections look correct on the character. Because that to me is where more I feel that that's more where real time is going right now. That's not to say that that's where it's going to go, but it just, in my experience at Digital Domain, that's mostly how we've been, I think, looking at it, at least as far as how it's used in feature films, not for real time projects, which would be a separate thing.
Yeah, and I feel like it's like you mentioned, like the green screen and the current video walls kind of thing that's going on. The video walls, they do seem like a better, kind of more immersive technology, where like if you put an actor or someone, it's not that just he has to imagine everything, right? He can actually see what's going on, and it seems like a better way to do it, right? Because we've seen hundreds of those videos where there's nothing there, like they're just kind of acting in this pavilion when there's just green screen and maybe some light guys and sound guys, and everything else is kind of like in their heads, right? And here you do have some images, you do have some information that you can process and maybe improve your performance or tell a better story. It seems like a better fit for this industry.
Yes, yeah, it definitely helps if the actors understand the world that they're supposed to be in and can react to it, for sure.
So I want to go a little bit into maybe some pinpoints that the industry has currently. And we mentioned a lot of software during our brief, what, it was like 40 minutes. Do you have enough people to kind of work with this software? Is there a need for more people who know like VFX, or more people who know substance designer? How do you recruit more talent? Like, do you go into schools? Do you find the talent in other studios? Like, how does that work?
We do go to schools. You know, some of the best artists we have on staff right now are people that we've hired out of schools.
Can you name some so people know where to go?
Sure. I mean, we've hired from Noman. We've hired from them. There's another school called the Dave School, which I believe is in Florida. We've hired from there. Those are the two like CG centric schools that we hire from, and usually when those schools, like Noman, for example, when their students are all graduating, oftentimes those schools will invite us to come to the school. I was invited one time to do that. Go to the school, and all the graduates or the kids who are getting ready to graduate, they're all sitting at their workstations, and they're just showing us their work. And I remember there was a guy whose work I looked at it, and he was really good at concepting. I noticed he had examples of all of his and this was several years ago. So he was concepting in Photoshop, and then he had examples of his concept that he had done in 2D, and he had built it in 3D, and he had made a little short out of it. And that really impressed me. And I thought, we got to hire this guy. And we wound up hiring him. And he worked on Avengers with me. And he wound up being a great artist. And we had him there for years.
We got to do a little shout out to Nomon, because if anyone is in LA area, and they can go there. They do tours over there, all of their areas, all of the classrooms, and they show kind of everything that's going on. This is such an amazing place. Like you go there and you just kind of like in that frame of mind immediately. There are like sculptures, and they have a gallery where you can see the students' work. It's fantastic. I've been there like several times. They invited me to do to different events and stuff, and they also do these lectures where they invite people who did Avengers, or they invite people who did like games and stuff, and they talk. And a lot of people, like you mentioned, they get hired from Nomon. They get hired to do very high-level stuff out of the school, which is kind of amazing. So, Greg, we have like this last bit in the interview where we do kind of like flash questions. Flash meaning that you don't have to undress or anything like that, but you have to answer like very quickly. You don't really need to think about it, and it's just kind of like fun bit where we try to end up the interview. I'm gonna read them from the screen. What's your favorite movie of all time?
Oh, wow. I think probably Aliens.
Alien, that's probably on my list as well. So what is the most underrated or little known film that you can recommend?
Oh, underrated or little known film.
Maybe underrated.
Does it have to be a visual effects movie, or
No, it can be anything.
any movie? There's a movie called Margin Call that comes to mind.
Oh man, this is such a nice film. I love it. I love it. I think in the United States, people should really watch this on repeat all the time. So, one more question. So, if you could do any other any job like for the rest of your life, what would you choose?
You know what? I would keep doing the same thing I'm doing right now. Honestly, I've been doing this now since the early 1990s, and every day is still like Christmas when I go into work to look at the renders.
And the final thing. So, if you had the power to kind of change one thing in this industry, like currently, like what would you change, or improve, or whatever?
Gosh, I think you know what? At this point in time, I would love it if we could all go back to work, actually, to the office, because working from home has its benefits, but I miss the camaraderie of being with my friends and my fellow artists, all in the same place.
All right. Well, Greg, once again, thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. I would love to continue talking for one more hour, but I want to be cautious of your time. Thank you for your work, and we'll leave the links to Digital Domain website in the description to the video so people can enjoy it. You know, maybe you have some open positions so people can check it out.
Great.
All right.
All right. Thank you
so much.
Thanks for enjoying another episode of the 80 Level Roundtable podcast. Check out upcoming episodes on the 80 Level website at 80.lv. Join our career site at 80.lv/RFP. And share our podcast with friends and on your social networks.